Welcome to the second Fletcher Ideas Industry Conference. Before we start, I must desperately thank the money, which is the Michael and Andrea Levin Foundation, which has funded a series of these conferences about the role of the marketplace of ideas in foreign policy. I could start by throwing quotes at you from Lincoln or from Keynes about the extent to which power interests don't matter all that much unless someone has some ideas behind that. That madmen in authority, think they're in charge, but they're actually probably echoing some academic scribbler from past. But I think the better way to think about it is that, for the last few years, I've seen a lot of talk about the role of impact. That's sort of the new buzzword when talking about think tanks or the academy or other structures in terms of how they influence foreign policy and the foreign policy machine and public policy more generally. And this requires looking closely at the institutions that generate these ideas and the pathways through which those institutions can actually influence policymaking. So we started this series of conferences with one in the spring about the role of the academy, the extent to which scholars can actually influence the way that policy gets implemented, the way that policy gets thought about. And seemed like a natural segue to go from academics or from the academy to think tanks. And I confess I have some personal motivation here. My very first professional job where I actually drew a salary, was as a summer intern at the RAND Corporation. And it was an interesting experience, having only been at a university before that, because RAND struck me as sort of a cross between a university and a law firm. And I'm going to hold to that impression as things gone forward in terms of how think tanks run. And as I said last night, I counsel a lot of Fletcher students here, and I cannot tell you the number of them that come into my office when I ask them what they want to be when they grow up, and they all say they want to work at a think tank. But they might not necessarily have the exact idea of what it is that think tanks do. We can clearly point to instances in recent years where think tanks have had a profound impact on foreign policy. Think of the role that AEI had in terms of the articulation of the surge strategy in Iraq post-2007. Think about the staffing of the first term of the Obama administration from CNES. These are clearly areas where they have a role. But questions are also being asked about their value added going forward. Are think tanks based in DC too homogenous? Have they become increasingly partisan? Are they autonomous enough from their funders to actually be considered credible sources of expertise? We're going to tackle all of these questions today in a series of panels. But we're going to start with a keynote from one of the founders of the newest and most successful think tanks recently. And to introduce her and to offer his own 2 cents about this question, I'm going to introduce a man who needs no introduction here, Dean James Stavridis.
Good morning and welcome to the Fletcher School. It's nice to see such a mix today of folks both from the think tank world, from our own students, some students from other institutions around Cambridge, I think a couple dropping in from the Washington area, and above all to welcome great friends and colleagues like Susan Marquis and of course Michèle Flournoy, who also needs no introduction, but I insist on giving her one. I'm going to start with a joke because I think jokes are important, and this is a joke about think tanks, and it kind of compares 3 think tanks. So I'm going to compare Brookings. Anybody here from Brookings? Terrific. CSIS. Anybody here? Okay. And Heritage. Anybody here from Heritage? You'll note that I've kind of covered the political spectrum. And so my little story is about a period of time going back almost 20 years to the Gulf War. And it seems during the Gulf War that 3 think tankers were actually, unfortunately, captured by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam said, well, I'm going to execute all 3 of them. One was from Brookings, one from CSIS, and one from Heritage. So Saddam assembled an audience and put in place a guillotine and brought up the first character from Brookings and said, I'll give you a chance to say any last words. And the Brookings scholar said, God bless America. And so they put him on the guillotine, dropped the blade, and it stopped 1 inch from his neck. So he was released. Saddam said, it's a divine intervention. We're going to let the Brookings scholar go. So the second scholar was the one from CSIS. And she was offered the opportunity to say last words, and being intelligent, she said, God bless America. Got on the guillotine, same thing happened. Blade stopped, just 1 inch. She was released. This was, of course, discouraging to Saddam, but the heritage guy was brought forward, and Saddam said, okay, what would you like to say? And he said, you know, I've been looking at this guillotine, and I think I know what's wrong with it. Okay. This is also a story about scholars and what they do and what they provide. Scholars from these think tanks are involved in the real world. They go forward. As a battle group commander in the Navy, I was lucky enough to have at my side a representative of the Center for Naval Analysis. She was terrific during my 2-star command as I commanded the strike group. She was incisive. She was unburdened by all of the political activity that goes on in a carrier strike group. She was objective. She was analytical, and her ideas had immediate impact on me throughout that particular period in 2000 and when was that? 2006, 2007. So I think it's an example of what this conference is all about, which is finding these scholars who can make real contributions. And the idea is, how do we create a transmission belt, if you will, that takes these ideas from the academy and moves them into decision makers' minds? It can be done with scholars who go forward into government, into real-world operations. It can occur because of papers that are published. It can occur because of conferences like this. But what I'd hope to see you explore are, what are the practical modalities to get the ideas in the academy into the hands of decision makers in a very practical sense. And there are real challenges in doing this, obviously. One is simple overload. There are so many ideas being created that really what we need is a filtration system, a way to rack and stack them, a way to direct them, a traffic cop who can send the right message to the right decision makers. So I think volume is a real challenge, and we ought to think about that. Secondly, I jokingly referred to the political spectrum with Brookings and CSIS and Heritage, but it's a very real element in this think tank world. What's the political alignment of a given think tank? How does it fit with the current administration? How can objective advice be brought to decision makers? That's a tough question. And when a think tank is on one side of the political spectrum, has brilliant people creating great ideas, are they hit with a penalty when an administration with a different political alignment comes in? And if so, how do you ensure that it might be even more important for those kind of ideas to be put in front of an administration, contrarian ideas to them? How does that happen? How do you overcome those kind of political cycles? And then lastly, I would say, back to the idea of a transmission belt, so much of what is done in the think tanks are words. Words are terrific, but people have to slow down and stop and read them. What are the new technologies that can take these ideas and convert them into visual presentations, into sound and music and light shows, into gaming? There are literally thousands of apps generated every month in the United States. What are the apps that apply to this world? How do you get beyond words? I think that's worth thinking about. So there's a little grist for the mill as you unfold, and I'll look forward to hearing the results. I will say I would love to stay and be part of this. I'm actually getting on an airplane, I hope you'll appreciate this, and going to a think tank. I'm going to CSIS in Washington to do a talk with my good friend John Greenert, the Chief of Naval Operations, about the future of maritime power. So I will be actually, hopefully, transmitting some ideas from the Academy to the practical world, right there with the current Chief of Naval Operations in a think tank setting. So I apologize in advance for leaving. Which brings me now to Madam Secretary, Michèle Flournoy, Harvard graduate, Oxford graduate. I love this. 20 years ago when Michèle and I first met in the Pentagon, she had, I think, the longest title in the building. I think there are some arguments about this, but her title was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Threat Reduction and Parking Lot Lighting. Now, I made up the last part. But everything up to the parking lot lighting she was in charge of and was brilliant and stood out. And anybody who met Michèle 20 years ago knew that she would go on to the kinds of positions she has held most recently, where she and I worked together during her, I think, almost 4-year tenure as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I would argue the most important job in the Pentagon, and one that drives this nation's policy in so many different ways. In that job, Michèle was known as innovative, intelligent, and above all, collegial. She was someone who could disagree without being disagreeable, and she represented the Pentagon extraordinarily well in the councils of the administration. And in that sense, was a powerful example of the academic and the think tank world coming into government and making very real contribution. She is the living embodiment of this idea. And as Jesse Jackson occasionally says, I think the Lord is not through with you yet. She will have a few more jobs ahead of her. So please join me in a big round of applause for an extraordinary woman, Michèle Flournoy.
Well, good morning, and it's wonderful to be here at Tufts and at Fletcher, and thank you for the very kind introduction, Jim. And great to see so many colleagues from other think tanks here. I wanted to start by sort of giving a lay of the land, if you will, sort of some basic facts about think tanks, paint the landscape, talk about the various roles that they play, and talk about a couple of cases where I've seen them have significant impact, and then also turn to the rather contentious issues that I think this conference will hopefully address. So first of all, I thought it was useful to start with a definition. If you go to the dictionary and look up think tank, you get a very unsatisfactory definition. But in my mind, so I'll give you my own, it's a think tank is a nonprofit research organization that develops analysis and recommendations on public policy issues, maybe domestic, maybe international, maybe both, to inform public debate and also influence or help policymakers make better decisions. Today, according to Jim McGann's, where's Jim? Wonderful survey, there he is, the University of Pennsylvania's 2013 Global Go-To Think Tank Index report, there are more than 6,000 think tanks, 6,800 think tanks globally. In North America, we have about 30% of those. More than 1,800 are in the United States, and nearly 400 of them are in Washington, D.C. You'll be pleased to know that the next highest number are in Massachusetts, 176. These think tanks come in a variety of flavors. In terms of their focus, they can be extremely broad, covering the full range of foreign policy and domestic policy, or very, very issue specific. They can range in size from hundreds and hundreds of scholars to a handful of people. If they can range in terms of affiliation from truly independent to university-based, to affiliated with a particular cause or professional association, to government-funded, like an FFRDC. And they can certainly range in terms of political orientation. Many think tanks, if not most, assert that they are nonpartisan, but in reality, as Admiral Stavridis just referred to, they really do array across the political spectrum, with, I think, there being pretty strong clusters at both ends, but also a sort of small core in the middle that it truly is attempts to be bipartisan or nonpartisan. One of the things I thought it was important to note is how the funding climate has changed for think tanks, particularly those that aren't government funded but rely on outside sources of support. Since the Great Recession of 2008, I think think tanks have been operating in a much more financially austere environment, in a tighter and more competitive market, if you will. The downturn made even many wealthy, highly wealthy individuals, billionaires, feel far less able to give to philanthropy. So individual giving has come down somewhat. Many foundations took a hit in terms of their stock market holdings and pulled back somewhat on their giving. And with the Budget Control Act and sequestration, even government funding for think tanks has come down. Consequently, many, though not all, think tanks have turned more and more to corporations in the business community for their support, and also to foreign sources of funding. And we'll come back to that when we get to the contentious issues section. We'll come back to discuss that. But I think it's important to note that the funding climate for most independent think tanks has changed pretty substantially in recent years. So let me turn now to what are the roles that think tanks can play. And I'll start with a quote from one of our colleagues, Richard Haass, who many of you know, who's the head of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former Bush administration official. He said, of the many influences on U.S. foreign policy formulation, the role of think tanks is among the most important and least appreciated. Role one is really helping develop new ideas, fresh thinking for policymakers. When you're in government, as many of you have experienced, you're dealing with the tyranny of the inbox. You know, the notion that no matter how many hours you spend in the day, if you can just deal with what's in your inbox, the crises of the day, you know, you're barely surviving. You're attending to the urgent as opposed to not always attending to the important. As former Secretary of State George Shultz said, people who are close to the problem can easily get dominated by tactics. That's the contribution of think tanks, strategy. And so at their best, I think think tanks can help policymakers raise their gaze, look over the horizon, beyond the crises of the day, to the longer term, more strategic issues that will have the greatest import for the United States over the longer term. Specifically, they can provide those in government with access to deeper expertise on a broader range of perspectives. Admiral Stavridis referred to dissenting views, the importance of hearing contrarian voices when you're making policy. They can provide out-of-the-box thinking, new ideas, fresh analysis, and recommendations for action. And again, the ability to take a more strategic view, to look beyond the crises of the day, ISIL, Russia, Ebola, to really think what's going to affect American interests long term and what would we be wise to prepare for today. So that's the first role. The second role is informing and elevating public discourse and debate. Think tanks can play a hugely important role in framing that debate, in providing analysis and insights to those who are engaged in the debate, whether it's journalists and media, pundits, members of Congress, and others. One of the major ways that think tanks exert influence is to have their experts quoted in the news, published in articles, blogging, op-ed pages, interviewed on TV and radio, testifying before Congress, and so forth. And this is a primary vehicle that think tanks obviously use to be noticed, get their ideas noticed in Washington and outside the Beltway. The fact is that we have such a robust ecosystem in the United States. And given that, you can usually find think tank experts on any side of any given debate. And often, many of us have been in various fora debating each other. But you know, as much as that might sometimes seem like the battle of the talking heads, in most cases there is the value of more data and analysis and different perspectives being put on the table than would otherwise be the case. And so, you know, I think there is value. It is, however, somewhat like using the internet. You have to be a very discerning consumer of information. So the third role, and that is convening conversations among stakeholders that otherwise wouldn't happen. And I think this is maybe one of the less appreciated roles that think tanks can play, but one of the most valuable. It's rare that executive branch officials, private sector leaders, staffers or members from the Hill, other experts can sit around a single table away from the glare of media and have a candid conversation about a difficult set of issues. This is an important contribution that think tanks can provide, providing that safe space, that convening space for those stakeholder conversations to happen and for new ideas to be generated and shared. It's also one of those transmission belts that was referred to earlier. At CNAS, I can say we've found this is one of the most important and impactful things that we do. The fourth role, again, often underappreciated, is incubating talent. Think tanks are not just ideas incubators. They are, with the right culture and focus, they can also be tremendous talent incubators. At CNAS, we actually made growing the next generation of national security leaders an explicit part of our mission. And we take a somewhat different approach to staffing by design. Many think tanks are populated with, formers, people who are at the tail end of their career and who kind of go out to pasture in think tanks. And in our case, we took more of an approach that says we want to be staffed primarily by futures, 30 and 40-something experts who are hungry, entrepreneurial, making a name for themselves, and we put that emphasis on launching them through professional development, mentoring, et cetera, into careers in public service. We actually have gone so far as we evaluate most of our senior people in part on how well they mentor and coach and develop the younger folks on staff. Another thing that's done, and this is not just to toot CNAS's horn, but others do this as well, is we actually encourage interns and RAs to write and publish, to start to find their voice in the public domain. Now, some think tanks do not allow this. They see it as too high a reputational risk to have someone unproven or early in their career kind of use the name of the think tank in publishing. But we have found that with that mentoring and coaching and support, it's actually a hugely valuable thing for the individuals and for our center. But talent incubation is key in terms of creating the next generation. As was mentioned, I think there are a number of think tanks that have supplied talent into the executive branch, into Congress. Think tanks are a great development opportunity for think tanks, for young people who do want to go into government. And the question is why? I mean, obviously you gain additional expertise and experience. You may have the opportunity to write and publish, but you're also meeting a number of people who are influencers, many of whom more senior people who may go back into government, and developing those relationships and those mentors is a part of that incubation and that opportunity for young talent as well. Fifth role is that think tanks are a part of this revolving door phenomenon in Washington. They provide a place for people coming out of government to continue to contribute to the debate. My special assistant, who's a Tufts graduate, Rebecca, she actually termed this rehab for former government officials. But in one of his memoirs, you're all familiar with the famous Henry Kissinger quote. He said, "High office teaches decision-making, not substance. A period in high office consumes intellectual capital. It does not create it." So in this light, think tanks offer a place for former or recovering senior officials to repack their intellectual suitcase, to make sense of what they experienced in government, to think anew about the future and to prepare for that future. P.J. Crowley, who many of you know, who is a fellow former think tanker and was Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, he went a step further and he said, think tanks in the United States are the closest thing we have to shadow government. But here's where I think there is a little bit a note of caution. We have to be careful that in this revolving door phenomenon, it doesn't just become a recycling and repackaging of the old with new labels. I do think it's very important for think tanks not only to be a home for people coming out of government who may go back in, but to be bringing fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, outside perspectives to the table and to the policymaker as well. I wanted to give you a couple of examples where I think tanks have had very direct impact on American foreign policy recently. There are many, many examples, and we could spend the whole day discussing them, but I'll just give you a couple. If you go back to the 1990s and you think about the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the emergence of a very different Europe, there was a huge debate about what the future of Europe would look like, and particularly whether the NATO alliance should enlarge. And when you go back to that period, the think tanks played a very interesting role. The late Ron Asmus, who worked at RAND, and many of you knew, he did an excellent case study in the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and it described how in the 1990s there was really demand for fresh thinking in this area, and think tanks really were the place where that thinking took place and was provided to government. Why couldn't government do this? First of all, they were focused on managing the crises of the day. Second, government tends to be very consensus oriented, even if it drives you to the lowest common denominator of what we can all agree on. Tends to be very risk averse, tends to be overloaded with short-term operational issues. And so in that context, there was a group of think tanks, RAND among them, that really laid out the pros and the cons of NATO enlargement. Very analytic case of what would it mean to enlarge and include Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, and others in this alliance. What would the implications be of that, political, military, economic, and so forth. And interestingly, that analysis became actually part of the paper that was supporting the interagency process. It was almost an expanded interagency process that was directly drawing on that think tank work to frame decisions for policymakers. Once the decision to pursue NATO enlargement was made, then those think tanks also played a very strong role in framing the public debate and in supporting the discussion more in Congress, in the media, and so forth. Another example that's already been mentioned is the role of think tanks at a couple of different phases of the second Iraq War. Recall that, while certainly when the Bush administration first went to war in 2003, that thinking was driven very much by strong views inside the administration from Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, among others. But when the war was really looking like it was being lost and in trouble, in 2006, it was outsiders who brought in the ideas to really set a new course. And here I would note, Fred and Kim Kagan, who many of you know, both, very well-known analysts in their own right, who happen to be married. I'll tell you a funny story. I traveled to Iraq with them once. They arrived, and the contractor running the building at the time refused to allow them to stay in the same room because they did not have their marriage certificate. So Kim was not happy having to room with me, so instead. But anyway, that story aside, Kim and Fred played a very important role, an AEI, in bringing the idea of the surge directly into the White House discussions and the NSC process, frankly, over the views and objections, in some cases, of senior leadership in the Pentagon. So very direct case of an outside, some think tank experts directly influencing decision-making at the highest levels about the course of the war. Post-surge, think tanks again played an outsized role and really laying the framework for the initial responsible drawdown framework. There was a report written at CNAS that I took part in, Colin Call led, that laid out a framework for gradually building up Iraqi capacity and gradually transitioning responsibility to the Iraqis. And that basic framework became adopted early on in 2009 in the Obama administration. Now, we could have a separate discussion about the degree to which that framework was departed from in implementation, which I believe it was. But the point is, there was, again, an example of a think tank report becoming a policy framework that had a lot of impact at the time. So let me turn now to some of the more contentious issues. You know, I'm someone who clearly believes that think tanks have a very positive role to play, but you know, they're not without controversy. So let me go through a couple of the concerns. The first is, you know, in the hyper-political environment that we live in Washington, you sometimes hear people say that, you know, think tanks may pretend to be nonpartisan, but they are inherently partisan. This is like warfare. This is politics by another means. And for those of you who like von Clausewitz, that was for you. It's true that, you know, think tanks can be plotted along the political spectrum. They are not all alike. It's worth considering very different approaches to how various think tanks approach this issue. One approach is to establish yourself in affinity with one end of the political spectrum or another. I would argue that Heritage and AEI have an established affinity with more conservative end of the spectrum, more Republican and makeup and so forth. Similarly, the Center for American Progress has established itself as the more progressive think tank affiliated predominantly with Democrats. And these institutions benefit enormously from those affiliations in terms of funding, in terms of influence in their respective ends of the spectrum, and so forth. Another approach is to aim to be nonpartisan by balancing Republicans and Democrats on your board, on your staff, and being very, very careful not to go after those highly controversial issues that would alienate one side or the other. Now, this approach has the benefit of reducing risk, but it also has the risk that you will be silent on some of the most important issues of the day. Still, a third approach to being nonpartisan is to be actively bipartisan, meaning to actively include and engage known Republicans, known Democrats throughout the organization, bring them together to deal with the most difficult issues, and seek to build a bipartisan consensus where you can, but also to explore and flesh out those areas where consensus is not possible, and to fully contribute to the debate in that case. So the bottom line is, you know, obviously think tanks operate in a political context, but they take such different approaches that it's very difficult to generalize. You really have to talk about the specifics when addressing this issue. The second concern is that too many think tanks cross the line between education and influence versus lobbying, even though they don't register as lobbyists. Most think tanks are what's called 501c3s. It's a part of the tax code that creates tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, in this case focused on education. Based on the IRS code, organizations that are 501c3s must keep lobbying or other legislative activity to a relatively insubstantial level, meaning they can do a little bit, but not very much. In addition, intervention or involvement in any political campaign or endorsement or anti-endorsement of any candidate is strictly prohibited. But the line between educating and lobbying can be a little blurry when think tanks engage on Capitol Hill. Let me just illustrate a difference, the difference. So in recent months, CNS has been up on the Hill conducting what we call a boot camp on Iran, basically engaging staff and members, trying to lay out, if a P5+1 negotiations, if they miraculously achieve some agreement, which I think it would be miraculous at this point, but if they did, what are the issues that you're going to face with? So let's talk about the history of Iran's nuclear program. Let's talk about what the enrichment process looks like. Let's talk about what breakout looks like. Let's talk about what verification measures look like. And so it's really preparing them to receive and review a potential agreement. By contrast, if there were a specific piece of legislation being considered on Iran, and CNAS experts were to go up on the Hill and advocate for passage of that legislation, that, I would say, is lobbying, not education. So it's very, very important, I find, to educate and train people in understanding what the law actually requires and how to steer clear of the line that whose crossing would get you in trouble. The third concern, and probably the greatest that I see right now, is with regard to funding and the question of whether there's inherent bias in the sources of one's funding. Many of you saw the September 6th New York Times story provocatively titled "Foreign Powers Buy Influence at Think Tanks." This was an article done by a team of investigative journalists which argued that more than a dozen prominent Washington research groups have received tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments in recent years while pushing the United States government to adopt policies that reflect the donors' priorities. They claimed to document at least 64 foreign governments, state-controlled entities, who had contributed a minimum of $92 million to a group of 28 think tanks over the last 4 years. Now, I think many of us had issues with the way that article was investigated and some of the things that were written, but I think the core issue is real. Certainly members of Congress think it's real. Within 2 weeks, there were some on the House of Representatives who were considering passing a rule that would require disclosure of any foreign funding from any think tank scholar who went to the Hill to testify. But I know that within the think tank community, and certainly within CNAS, it's raised this debate of, are we doing enough to ensure that there isn't undue bias introduced by any source of funding, foreign or otherwise. And so we've been reviewing, and I know many others have been, best practices. One is transparency, listing all of your donors on your website, at least, if not with exact dollar figures, in bands of giving. Second, having very consistent and clear language that's used in all proposals and contracts that specifies and safeguards independence and editorial control. Third is internal oversight mechanisms. I mean, it's not enough just to say this stuff. You've got to have processes in place to ensure that you're living according to your standards. For us, we have an executive committee of our board that reviews and approves any acceptance of foreign funding, for example. But also internal controls to ensure editorial independence. You know, at a place like CNS, it's a little easier in that we don't take institutional positions. Our scholars have their own views, and we, as you've seen, we often debate each other. But it's very, very important, again, to address this issue. Another approach is pooling of funding, so that there's never a single foreign or corporate donor for a given project, but you have multiple sources of funding, and so there's bias that washes out, if you will. But this is a very real problem, whether or not you accept foreign funding. Even if you accept just foundation and individual funding, as Xenia and I were talking last night, every funder has intent. They're giving you money for a reason. And what you have to ensure in running a think tank is that that bias does not creep in to your analysis or constrain your analysis. And I'll give you an example. The issue, there is a problem that perception can be reality here. Even when best practices are followed, you have to ask at the end of the day, will the work be perceived as biased or pulling punches given the source of the funding? And, without naming names, if there is a Middle East country that is providing, millions of dollars to a program, and that country is known to have issues with regard to protection of minority rights or democratic reform, and that program that deals with the region never touches those issues, is there bias? Has bias been introduced, even if it's a matter of what the work that's not being done or the punches that are being pulled? And so, I think this is a very serious set of issues that think tanks have to think through to maintain their independence and their integrity. I think that the next chapter in this discussion is going to be about corporate donors and looking hard at companies that give money and how that money is used and whether that biases think tank analysis. There are some organizations that call themselves think tanks that actually accept money from corporations to do very specific work that tends to advocate the programs those companies produce. And I think that sort of taints makes the waters more murky, and it also raises the bar for everybody else who's serious about independence to ensure that that's not happening more broadly. So in sum, I am a believer. I believe that think tanks can play a very important role as part of our broader public policy ecosystem for all the reasons I've described: developing new policy ideas, elevating the public debate, convening important stakeholder discussions, incubating talent, providing that a place for former and future officials to repack their intellectual suitcases. But it's important to note also what they cannot do. They cannot guarantee good decisions will be made by those in power. This is a you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink situation. They cannot eliminate the role of politics in the making of national security policy. They cannot ensure that stakeholder conversations will translate into the kind of public-private partnerships that are so important to effectively implement many of our policy decisions these days. They can grow talent, but they can't ensure that talent finds its way into the right places at the right time. And sadly, they cannot solve the fundamental dysfunction that is currently paralyzing our divided government in Washington. That said, again, I think our policy deliberations, our democracy are more vibrant because of think tanks. And on that positive note, let me conclude and open it up for discussion. So, thanks.
I found your recalling of the 90s and the Ron Asmus NATO debate really kind of haunting if you compare it to maybe a paucity of similar ideas, receptivity to similar ideas around the Arab Spring. And I wonder if both from where you were sitting during the Arab Spring and where you're sitting now, you could ruminate a little bit about how and why that was different and what it says about the think tank environment and how it's changed. Just having lived through the 90s and thinking about that period and comparing it to what we face now, it's a haunting comparison to me how much less well equipped we were as a think tank infrastructure as well as a government, and I wonder why you think that is.
I think in the 1990s, we were in a much stronger position with incredible leverage coming out of having essentially won the Cold War and being in a position to, the United States being in a position to have huge influence on the kind of Europe that emerged from that situation. And so there was an overwhelming sense of opportunity and challenge, but also real opportunity and real leverage. And so I think that, and there was also deep expertise in the sense that it was the defining problem, focusing on Russia, focusing on Europe, understanding the NATO-Warsaw Pact dynamics. We had, decades of that being the almost singular focus or the primary focus of so many in the academia, in the think tank world, that they were just poised when this opportunity arose to, I think about that next chapter and finally freed from some of the constraints that they'd been working under since the end of World War II. In the case of the Arab Spring, I think it certainly also caught people by surprise, but I think there is a sense of a much more complicated situation, less leverage for outside influence. Not, significant leverage, but less in a relative terms to where we stood with Europe at the end of the Cold War. More complexity in terms of, the inadequacy of the boundaries that have been drawn in the region, the non-existence of strong institutions, the Shia-Sunni tensions, the violent extremist organizations that have taken root and grown. I mean, it's just a much more complicated witch's brew, and I think with a sense of, and then I think far fewer people have been focused on it. I think there's less, there's certainly a lot of expertise out there, but there's been less thinking done about how to take advantage of any opportunity that might arise there. And so, and I also think that there's been less leveraging on the part of the US government of what expertise there is outside and what thinking there is outside. In this case, when you compare it to that NATO, in the NATO case, the think tanks were almost brought into the interagency process, almost by extension. In this case, I think it's, there hasn't been that depth of dialogue and mutual exploration of what the possibilities are. But it is a very stark contrast.
Sarah Detzner, PhD student here. Thanks so much for coming and talking to us. I had hoped to ask you for an incredibly subjective judgment. But if think tanks live and die on their reputation, do you think that the incentives... I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Do you think that the incentives are currently aligned properly such that think tanks are incentivized to come up with interesting new ideas, to take risks, to push themselves a little bit? No. Is that rewarded reputationally?
Short answer, no. Next question? No. One of the things I find, and again, I don't want to step on any toes here, but funders tend to follow the debates. They tend to jump in on issues that are already established. One of the things we've done, again, I apologize for keep referencing CNAS, but it is my base of experience. So we've established an innovation fund, and what we're trying to do is get unrestricted monies that we can use to seed new lines of inquiry or new projects or new things that seem, or even experiment with the risk of some failure. It's very hard to get unrestricted money, and the restricted project money tends to be following the debate that's already established or the lines of debate that are already established. So again, what we've tried to do is create a fund that, and interestingly, the main contributors to this fund have been entrepreneurs who kind of get this idea that you want to have the ability to seed an area, to start developing intellectual capital, and then with that base, with that initial capital, then get other people excited and say, ooh, that's a new line of it, that looks interesting, let me follow that. But it takes a certain out-of-hide investment up front to go there. Similarly, when you're looking at different tools and methods, leveraging social media, leveraging different web-based tools, leveraging different ways of delivering content that's not just publishing big, thick reports and putting them, handing and distributing them. That also, there's some experimentation. Not every great idea, the idea that seems great, is going to actually work out. So I think that's one of the things that think tanks struggle with. I think those that have large operating reserves and endowments tend to at least be positioned to do that theoretically. But I think there's a lot of self-imposed conservatism, in small c conservatism in think tanks, of people being afraid to try something new, to publicly fail if it doesn't work out, and so forth. So, the nice thing about being small is and sort of scrappy is that you can take some risks, and occasionally you fall on your face, but the next time you'll do better and so forth. But I do think the incentives are generally against innovation and risk taking. Yeah, senior.
You kind of finished your comments on political partisanship in Washington. What role can think tanks, I mean, you've seen the media almost become more partisan rather than less. Certainly that's the external view of it. I would argue that actually you've seen think tanks often become more partisan rather than less over the last, say, 5 years to a decade.
Yeah.
Is there a way that think tanks can have a role in bridging?
Yeah.
And are you seeing that actually happen, or do you also, sitting in Washington, see that increasing in partisanship just because that's the environment, what we get fed by is where we can kind of sell our ideas?
I do think, the think tanks can play a role, and particularly in developing smart policy ideas where you can get people on both sides of the aisles, as well as independents and others, agreeing this is just smart. This just makes sense for the United States or for the world. Doesn't matter what your party politics are. This just makes sense, and we're willing to sign up. I'll give you an example. We about 10 think tanks put together signed a letter on defense reform and sent it up to the Hill and said, for God's sake, please give this secretary the authorities to manage this drawdown. If you're going to put sequestration and budget pressures in place, which many of us disagree with, but everybody agrees that you've got to allow the Defense Department to reform. So allow BRAC, allow compensation reform, allow healthcare restructuring, and we had 10 different think tanks from all different persuasions sign up on that letter and push it forward. And that is an example, and I think that creates a certain safe space for members of different parties to say, oh, well, AEI supported it or Heritage supported it, so I'm a conservative Republican, I can support this. CAP signed on, others signed on, I can support this as a Democrat. So I do think there is that role, and that should be explored more fully. I think as we head into, interesting, as we head into a presidential election cycle, there's a push-pull tension. On the one hand, there are a lot of think tanks that are going to want to be part of trying to seek and define that bipartisan consensus where it can be found. There are many that will partner together to do events and debates and that kind of thing, and even projects and publications. On the other hand, many of the individuals involved are going to be drawn into different campaigns. Again, here's where the philosophy matters. I mean, in some think tanks, they're terrified of having their people in their private time being involved in campaigns. Our approach has been different to say, when you're at CNAS, we are focused on doing your best work, but we want the transmission belt of people being connected to virtually every campaign, ideally. We can't control that, but we encourage people to take the ideas and inject them everywhere. And so the idea is, if it's a smart idea, it's maybe not one that gets polarized, doesn't polarize people, but actually says, hey, this is actually something we can agree on. And it gives it some legs, whether a Democrat wins or a Republican wins. But I do think there is an important role there. The key is to not water down the consensus to be meaningless. To find the agreement where you can, but there are going to be things on which there are deep disagreements, and it's useful to flesh those out as well and to articulate them and why.
Michèle, an excellent
Yes.
tour de force in terms of the issues that we'll address at the conference, hopefully today. There are a few things that I wanted to potentially hear your response to, and what I see as sort of existential threats for all knowledge-based institutions and think tanks in particular. Things like big data, new technology, and the incredible rate of technological change and the direct implication, in terms of the vanishing papers, publishing houses, and think tanks. I think there's an interconnection between those, and some of these are larger drivers. The increased specialization, which you didn't mention, which is, in terms of most of the think tanks that have come into existence since 70s and 80s are specialized, so there's no longer the general purpose think tank, and what does that mean? What's the drivers behind that?
the notion of hybridization, so the blurring of think tanks, and what you mentioned in terms of competition, my assessment is, at both domestic and international, that the competition is historically was think tanks in competition with other think tanks. That is no longer the case. They're in competition with law firms, lobbyists, advocacy-oriented organizations, and consulting firms, for-profit consulting firms. And so how does all of that impact in terms of what in terms of your institution and your perspective on these things, and the fact that these, and while things like the funding and transparency are important, there are all of these other drivers, larger drivers, that have tremendous impact and are defining and reshaping think tanks that I think, and I'm all for transparency. The question is, are we missing and understanding these important dynamics, and most importantly, in understanding them so that the institutions can prepare for that? So if you could comment on that.
Yeah. I'll try to comment on a couple of these. No, but so a couple of these. I mean, I think the real challenge is, especially for I think the bigger, more established institutions, the challenge of adaptation to big data, to new technologies, to new ways of information being disseminated. The rate of change is more challenging, I think. We actually see the big data piece and the technology piece as an opportunity. I'll give you an example. We have launched a veteran, in partnership with Palantir, a veterans data project where we've vacuumed up all of the publicly available demographic data on veterans and then purchased some proprietary data. And Palantir's helped us structure it into queryable databases, visualize it in terms of graphics you can manipulate, and so forth. And and we're able to do scenario-based analysis that really, for the first time, tries to put some data behind veterans' needs now and in the future, where there's all this philanthropic giving, but it's based on almost no data about what works and what the needs are and where they are and so forth. And so for us, we see in an area like that, big data is a huge opportunity if you can figure out how to get your arms around it. We knew that we didn't have that expertise in-house, so we partnered with someone who does, and that's gone very well. But I think it's that kind of, how do you leverage the opportunity that's going to be very important, but it also means that you'll have to change the way you operate in some cases. And even we don't publish a lot of reports out of that project. A lot of it is the display of the data and short, needs assessments in geographic areas and so forth. On the hybridization, I think that's a really interesting point. The competition has broadened beyond just think tank versus think tank to think tank versus, as all the entities you described, many of them private sector and working for a profit. I think two things. One is that, in my view, it drives you to have a very acute sense of what is your comparative advantage. What can you do that others cannot do? And I think it's a lot easier to do that as a smaller organization and very nimble, and versus a much larger one that has a lot more ground to cover. Secondly, though, I do think it pulls you into this ethical discussion about, if you're competing, if you're getting relatively more of your money from corporate sources or from foreign government sources, and your competition is in private sector, partly. And they're approaching these folks and saying, well, here's my value proposition. Here's what I'm going to do for you. As a think tank, it's not bad to have that conversation, but you have to be very careful that you're not tying or skewing your research agenda to, that model that I talked about before was, the corporate sponsor gives you the objective and you do the analysis to support it. I mean, then you're lost. You have lost your integrity, you've lost your independence, and so forth. So I think that pressure is putting more think tanks in situations where you really have to think deeply about the values that the organization has and the ethics of what money you take for what purposes. And I don't think, when I look across the board, and I don't think we're where we need to be there. And in some cases, I think that it's hard. You have to walk away from money. You have to be willing to walk away from certain types of money to say, not going to go there. And I'll just hold up New America as an example. CNAS has chosen a different way of handling this, but New America said we're going to do defense work, so we're not going to take any money from defense firms. That's one very clear way of handling this. But I think that's the kind of conversations think tanks need to be having internally, and I think that the level of scrutiny is only going up, the level of transparency is only going up, so you're wise to be very clear on what your lines are.
I was going to ask the last question, but actually Jim again pretty much preempted it, and we've run out of time, and you have a flight to get to. Okay. So won't you all join me in thanking Ms. Flournoy for kicking things off?